We have today with us someone who needs very little introduction, Ranjit Hoskote, who's a well-known writer, poet, art critic. It goes on, but I'd simply say a friend. And he will help us analyze the two paintings on view a little better than a very simplistic impression that I carry of them. Thank you, Ranjit. Okay, so the two works we see here, Last Supper in red and Last Supper in blue, were part of a much larger body of work titled Let History Cut Across Me Without Me, which was painted between, I think, 91 to 92. And Roshan Sani, who I see right across me, wrote the catalogue essay for it. And this was presented by the Vadera Art Gallery at the Jahangir Art Gallery, I think around 93, 94. And that's when we saw these for the first time. And they truly left a lasting impression on most people who saw them then. Husain at that stage always said he wanted that whole body of work to stay together. He didn't want it fragmented. And I think everyone respected them, and sadly, poor Vadera Art Gallery couldn't make any sales. But over the years, I got to know that he had parted with a couple of them. And I approached him about, quite obviously and naively, I would say, of wanting to acquire the Last Supper in red. And he said, I'm happy to part with it to you, but it doesn't come as, one work is both. The blue and the red are basically one painting. And I was disappointed, but then he quickly added, there's no pressure on you, you can take your time to pay for them. And that eased it up. And genuinely, he never sort of put any pressure on me. And then over the years, they've just stayed rolled, and every 8, 10, 12 years, we've opened them up at the gallery just to relax the canvas for a couple of weeks and then roll them back up. And it's happened for the first time here at Hamilton House that we opened them up about 10 days ago. And they were lying here and we kept looking at them, and Khorshid said it would be lovely to display them. I said, yeah, sure it would be, but when and how, I don't know. And she said, do it now. And it was too much of an effort. So my first reaction was no. And then slowly I got around to doing it, and over the Diwali holidays, we hung both the paintings up. The challenge was first getting them right and straight, and two was getting them lit correctly, which I'm afraid we could have done a better job of, but we've been working on the last 4 days on it to the best of our abilities. But looking at these paintings over time, I've understood them a lot better. I've read them quite differently from the artist. For example, he describes the painting in the blue as, I always saw the two central figures as Adam and Eve. And, you know, the apple in the bottom right corner, and it all connected to me, and, you know, the certain sort of evil that came out of it. And the artist describes the paintings as the black Adam on the left and the crucified Eve on the right. And then when I thought of it, I said, yes, he's absolutely right. It is actually one painting, because both the panels discuss duality, where, you know, good and evil have to coexist. And you have all these sort of the soldier and difficult subjects, the sort of devil, but who are they supported by? The angels at the bottom. And this panel, where you see figures who are supposed to be these sort of more sort of respectable figures, who are they supported by? The devil. So there is a duality to it, and I think life is all about duality. And I don't know what it was at the time when I first saw them, but, you know, very often Husain, right through his career, has been sort of criticized for, oh, you know, he's past his prime, he has nothing more to say. And invariably, he's come out with a body of work which has taken everyone by surprise and made people sit up again and take notice. Something about these two, when I first saw them, told me that they were iconic. And so many years later, even when I look back at them now, I still believe they're iconic. So I think now I'll leave it to Ranjit to differ from me here.
I wouldn't differ at all, actually. But I might just approach these works differently. Also, Let me begin by thanking everyone for being here with us this evening. It's an unusual kind of festivity to bring out paintings that have been seen for a long time and then to share them and celebrate them in this. Working again, yeah. So thank you, Dadiba, and to everyone at PUNDOLE'S really for coming up with this idea of showing with no necessary practical outcome, but just the joy of revisiting an artist who really, through most of his career, was, I would have to say, the national painter in many ways, until the events of later in his career, and I will have a few things to say about that as well. Personally, I began as someone who was rather critical as a young critic of Husain, and over these many years, especially the last decade when I've been looking and working intensively with his work, especially in the context of the museum that's now coming up, the Husain Museum in Qatar, and an exhibition that I did of his work in 2019 for Mathaf in Doha. It was a lesson in humility, in thinking back to this extraordinary and kaleidoscopic figure with so many different artistic preoccupations and so many ways of reaching out to the world. So I'm hoping that, brief and schematic as my talk will be today, I'll try and bring some of this into play. And each time I get up to, in this case I'm not even getting up, but to talk about paintings, I'm reminded of a primal experience of viewing, of thinking about viewing that I had as a child. I must have been 9 or 10 when I saw Kenneth Clarke's TV series, which presumably very few people here will remember, Civilization. And I always think back to how Kenneth Clarke would get up and say, and this painting by Raphael. And I said, you know, there's some kind of magic to looking at paintings, and static as they seem, they release themselves in various forms of mobility. And we think we are decoding them, but exactly as was just made evident in what you said, Dadiba, the code will always resist what we think it's about. So what I'm going to try and do is maybe go back into certain contexts in which one could place Husain's work, and not worry too much about what the paintings might mean, but to think about the kinds of intellectual and affective worlds that they come from. The very first thing that struck me, Dadiba, when you raised this thought about this event and shared the images, I thought, you know, there was something about Husain that was focused on optics. I think in one sense, color and light are, of course, very, very basic to the painterly enterprise. But I just thought of the Doppler shift when you said there are these two paintings. They clearly are twin companion pieces. And they suggest that we're in the presence of the Doppler effect. The blue shift in wavelength is when objects are coming towards you. The red shift when they're moving away. So in a way, it's metaphorical of meaning in artworks. You know, they approach, you think the artwork is coming towards you and releasing itself, and then it moves away, and we are literally, very literally, at this point, in the middle of that shift. And I want to place this in the context of a body of work which intrigues me to this day, the Raman effect, which he showed at PUNDOLE in the 1980s, wasn't it? Early 80s? Yeah. And it reminds us that the Husain that people saw as a public figure seemed to be someone who was very spontaneous. And there was that entire drama of how he could execute a painting within minutes and so on and so forth. That was, if you will, the front end of his work. The back end, as we realize, was also formidable forms of research. And in Doha, again, when I had the privilege of looking at his library, his writings, the books from Sheikh Hassan's library that he worked with, and it's incredible the degree of reading and focused attention that he brought to his work. So it's convenient now to think of the modernists as having worked out of some kind of spontaneous inspiration, and that research-based art is more recent. it's interesting to think about the kinds of research that artists like Husain would have brought to their work. I'm just putting that thought in play for now. I also want to think about, or rather these images prompt us to think about the Last Supper as a genre. And I think for many, many of us, the first image that pops up is, in fact, the late 15th century Da Vinci Last Supper, which is a theater of frontality. You have Jesus and the apostles all facing us, and there's a drama of the voice of heaven. There's a drama of betrayal that goes on there. Of course, we also know that the Last Supper was represented in different ways before. You would have the apostles seated in circles, in groups, and so on. But there's something about Da Vinci's Last Supper which dramatizes this event, if you will, for all time. And then that's become the template. In this case, I think what happens with Husain is that he takes that up and then he fragments it in interesting ways. He preserves the Da Vinci notion of a theater of frontality, but he changes the protagonists. There are other kinds of moral and political dramas that unfold. And it also reminds us that, if we go in some nominalist way by the title, say the Last Supper in blue and the Last Supper in red, we're not looking at Cranach here. We're looking at Husain. We're not looking at Dürer. We're looking at Husain. We're looking at someone who really had a certain confidence to be an inventor with the materials of culture. And again, I think we need to retrieve what that meant for this first generation of post-colonial Indian artists to emerge from a history of violence and deficit. Oh, we even have musical accompaniment. This is good news. To think about this group of artists, not only the progressives in a Bombay context, but also practitioners in Shantiniketan, in Lahore, in Chennai. These were all people who were grappling with larger civilizational issues of how to belong both to this nascent nation state with all its turbulences, but also how to belong as inheritors to a larger, for what it's worth, Eurocentric at that point, but still transnational and global context of art making. And which is why I think when we look at these works, we should take that notion of the Last Supper with a pinch of salt. What is, I would think less about the Da Vinci template and more about what kinds of endings or what kinds of pivotal moments is Husain asking us to look at here. And I would also place this kind of work, this whole genre of work, in the abiding context of Husain's work with the religious imagination. Again, there is, with good reason, we often think of the project of modernity as being premised on a project of secularizing. And there's good reason for that, as I said. But it sometimes leads us to either explain away or not look too carefully at the fact that there's a wager on the sacred. There's a wager on using religious imagery, not to simplify it in non-sacred contexts, but to see what mysteries it could hold for us. And I'm thinking here of Husain's Theorama series, the paintings as well as the silk screen prints and all of the other experiments that went with it. It was a massively encyclopedic endeavor. That's the other thing I wanted to say earlier. There was something encyclopedic and polymathic in Husain's approach to the world. It spanned the arts and sciences. It spanned circumstances of place. It went across this notion that you needed to somehow be an Indian artist. There was this ability to belong widely. And also what I find happening here is this lifelong dialogue with Picasso that Husain had. And I'm thinking that in many ways Guernica it's been described, I can't remember if it was John Berger, but it's been famously described as possibly the last history painting in the European tradition. The history painting begins with biblical narratives, it then passes to narratives of revolution and state in the hands of an artist like David. And with Picasso, it's this elegiac bearing of witness to fascism and its violence, and what that means in terms of havoc wrought on communities and individuals. And I keep thinking of what that would have meant, that particular dialogue. In one sense, a rivalry, in another sense, a comparison of notes. Husain thinking about Picasso, the careers in many ways similar, the nomadic approach to life, the ranging across genre and style and medium, but also the sense of how does one capture the tragedy of the human subject. So it's, as I said, it's these contexts, I think, that enrich our understanding of these works. So if we ask ourselves, what do these paintings mean? I think it would be good to trust both our own intuitions and to think about the artist's intuitions in constructing these paintings. When I look at the work in blue, for instance, all kinds of thoughts come to me. These were paintings rendered in the early 1990s. It was a time of incredible warfare. And I'm thinking that Husain, and we just also saw another series by Husain that you brought to light. Not only the Gulf series, but also this constant meditation on warfare and on the figure of the soldier. And I can't help but think that he was also preoccupied with events unfolding in Iraq at the time, in Afghanistan, in the Gulf, and elsewhere. And that comes into this and is somehow overlaid on prior images of the two world wars, of partition, and so on. So that current that deals with war is very, very prominent here. But over against that is this playful figure of the devil in the television, literally in the box. That seems to take us to something else, which is a history of popular imagery. Does anybody remember the Oneida devil? Yeah. Yeah. What was it? Neighbor's envy, owner's pride.
That's right.
So I'm also thinking of how a painting like this can have grandeur and tragedy, but can also take materials and images and currents from very everyday life and popular culture. And also the way in which he feels able to literally fuse the two testaments in the figure of the crucified Eve. I would not have guessed that that was the crucified Eve, by the way. But also the way in which the cherubs come in and the devils on the other side, it also suggests that here is an artist who doesn't take scripture to be dogmatic, but that it is a set of impulses and possibilities that you recraft to think about the human adventure. And if we go around to the other side, this notion of bringing together a set of annotations or obsessions becomes even more powerful. To the left of the Last Supper in red is a figure that Husain was preoccupied by. It was Buster Keaton. So there's also Husain's life in cinema, so to speak, as a viewer, as a consumer of cinema, but also as a creator of cinema eventually. So again, there's this compelling adjacency between the figure of Buster Keaton, a comedian, and a figure that seems to be drawn from Michelangelo's Moses, right next to him. Or Aristotle, is that what he says in the notes? Yeah. So, and then from Husain's notes, we know that this blindfold figure with the sword is intended to be Damocles, literally cleaving the table. But again, it seems to point forward to projects that he was going to take forward in the last decade of his life, which had to do with Islamic civilization, for instance, and also Indic civilization. So when I look at these works, I'm also thinking of them as somehow preparatory works for these much larger encyclopedic projects. And it leaves us, I think, with this question of how do you place an artist's private glossary alongside what more collective formations take to be iconography. And I think that's where I would probably end, by thinking about the degrees of freedom available to an artist. what happens to paintings like these when they are placed alongside collective bodies of belief? And how does one secure them from looking like either simple translations, which they're not, or blasphemous derivations or deviations? I think actually paintings like these open us up to this consideration of how artists like Husain really felt both confident and able to really wrestle with these questions. And I would end by thinking about whether we as an audience have kept up with that confidence.
I don't think blasphemy was ever on his agenda. But I think Husain was maybe 2 decades a little early, because he always wanted to work on scale and volume, but sadly never found patrons for it. So we're waiting till 91, early 90s, when he comes out with such large canvases and such a large body of work, which, as you mentioned, he continued with 99 works on the Arab civilization, and then simultaneously working on another body of work in London on the Indian civilization. Sadly, both remained unfulfilled, but I think he just needed that opportunity, and he needed a patron, and he needed the support. And sadly, galleries were not in a position to extend the kind of support these kind of projects needed. So I think you'd have seen a lot more of this. And he always said towards the end of his life, I have so much to say and so little time.
But also, I think it leaves open the question of patronage is one end of this. The other end of it is an audience that in these decades was changing fast.
True.
And also forces of, I wouldn't say public opinion, but the manipulation of public opinion, which tended to force artists like Husain into a corner. So there's no simple answer to this.
So I think life is a cycle in that sense. You mentioned Guernica and how Picasso had the ability to make a political comment, which I think artists prior to that never had the opportunity, because countries were ruled by kings, and kings kind of controlled the subjects, or the church controlled, or the priestly class controlled. So to be critical of them was always difficult. Now comes this little window of time when the world is a lot more liberal and artists are free to express, and now we've gone back into the cycle where sadly it's curbed. But when we look back from a historic context, it opens so many eyes, which today we are trying to blind people by.
It's also, when I look at paintings like this, what I find compelling is the artist's curiosity about various domains of human experience and what lies beyond human experience. I'm also compelled by his ability to be critical of received dogma, critical not just in a corrosive way, but critical as in there's a certain playfulness, there's an ability to combine and recombine elements. So it's, how does one account for that kind of creativity in criticality, creativity, the ability to retell stories at a point when there are very, very powerful dogmas about reading, about interpretation, about what may be said, what may be shown?
I mean, having known him, I genuinely know that he was very sensitive to his audience. It's not that he was insensitive in the way he's made out to be. So he always knew where not to transcend the line. How far he could push boundaries and how far he could make people see things in a different manner, but not offend. The whole thing about offense, I think, has been just created, is a separate issue.
It's not a separate issue, unfortunately, because there's such a formidable body of people who claim the right to be offended that it's really a question of about how one is able to even present work like Husain's. And different kinds of people have different kinds of objections to various parts of his oeuvre. So now this is for me also a very real and practical issue in terms of imagining what kinds of institutions could show work like this?
I think we're just becoming a very touchy bunch of people. As a whole, I don't mean any individual, me included. And I think if we pay too much attention to that aspect, we'll do nothing in life. As long as each one works with the right intentions and what one believes in, I think one has to continue with it. The consequences, whatever they be, will follow. And one has to counter them with debate, discussion. And it happened to us when that whole sort of movement was strong against him. We used to get a lot of these sort of vicious calls at the gallery. And I would engage with them in conversation. And within a few minutes, they had nothing to say, because when I discussed it and I asked them questions, it would fall completely flat. And on many occasions, I had people finally saying sorry and hanging up the phone on me. Because they'd been just mobilized to say and vocalize what they didn't really comprehend. So I think ignore that part of it. Because that's also, I think, a passing phase. Nothing is permanent.
No one would hope that is true, but there's also, even an event like this is beautiful for that reason. We're able to look at the work for itself, to go back into a space of wonderment and to retrieve what was truly important about this man's imagination and his contribution.
I just think we're making too much out of it in terms of, if we believe that what we're doing is wrong, then I don't think we should be in this business. So we just continue with what we're doing. What we believe, as I said, there's no intention to offend anyone.
Also, exactly, it's part of what this argument of mine is about, is that if we place it in these multiple contexts of where it's coming from, it just demonstrates that there are other lenses through which to view his life and his work, and not just this more recent one that we're looking through.
Sure. So, when we talk of this, sorry, it was Ram Manohar Lohia who encouraged Husain to paint the Ramayana. And it wasn't that Husain didn't know about the Ramayana, because as a child he used to attend the Ram Leela, etc. So he was quite familiar with it. I forget his friend, Mankesh was his friend who used to take him to the Ram Leela. And he hired scholars to read the Mahabharata and interpret it, the Ramayana, to interpret it with him. So it wasn't done in a superficial manner. And as he says, that there was some sort of very abstract images, like, let's say he had a sort of mass of orange. He said urban audiences would either pretend they knew what it was or not know what to say. But he says rural India, when they saw those images, the response was Hanuman. It didn't take them, because theirs was an honest, direct response to what they saw. They weren't trying to sort of analyze too much, or trying that, the artist trying to be too clever about it. It was a spontaneous response, which is exactly what he had meant. So there are many ways you can interpret a work, and it's how open you are to it.
Yeah, it reminds me of actually a Films Division documentary which was in circulation, which actually takes us through this process of Husain's preparation for these works. Yeah.
And then he decided to tackle the Mahabharata, which was done in a similar fashion, which is when he was invited to the Sao Paulo Biennale. And as he says, time was running out and he didn't know what he was going to really paint. And typical Husain, he wanted to make a little noise about this because he was invited to show with Picasso. So we did an exhibition at the gallery, which was basically just drawings on the Mahabharata. And he had decided that's what he'd paint, but he had not done a single painting. I believe a few weeks before the opening, he went to Paris, locked himself in a room, and painted the entire body of work there. Rolled it and took it with him to Sao Paulo and exhibited it there. But when you think of that volume of work that was produced in those 2 or 3 weeks, it's just mind-boggling. But as he says, he'd even told people to leave his food outside his room. He was not to be disturbed. And it was locked in that room that he painted that entire body of work.
Yeah, which is what we see in these works too. There might be a certain focus and speed of execution. But behind that lies, a much longer cycle of reading, of research, of dialogue and conversation.
Oh, huge, and he analyzed a lot in his head. He was a silent person, so he did think things through before he spoke, and he spoke very carefully when he did. But you see, he had also lived through a lot of life, seen a lot of it, read a lot of it, heard a lot of it, experienced a lot of it. And that honesty of all those experiences comes through in his work. There's nothing very pretentious about it at all. At least that's the impression I carry. It's quite straightforward. We tend to make it very complicated when we're looking at a work. Or at least I tend to.
Not sure I agree with the idea that it's straightforward. I don't think anything in his work was, in that sense, straightforward. I think it was his ability to move with a certain degree of felicity across contexts, across time and space, and across disciplines. I think to me, that's the source of the mystery of his work, always.
True. Time and space was something that fascinated him always. And it was a concept that it took me very long to understand. It's when I think of Indian mythology that I really understand what time and space means. And that's what he brings in this body of work, because it crosses across so many centuries that when you see it today, and as I said, I always had this problem of looking at this through Da Vinci's eyes. And that was the mistake I kept making. It just shares a similar title and a basic kind of framework. But he brings in elements which cross from biblical times to now. And that's where I think a new kind of language evolves in the paintings.
Also, even in, if you will, theological terms, what happens with this table is that it stands for koinonia, the idea that there is a certain fellowship that emerges, a spiritual fellowship from literally breaking bread, participating in the Eucharist. So the table isn't just a piece of furniture in Christian theology. It actually is both a social and a spiritual occasion of communion. And it's interesting when you look at these works that it isn't fellowship, it becomes another kind of common ground for what look like very disparate elements, and then you're invited to put it all together. What is it that brings these strange figures together? Like, is that a judge with a peruke, or what exactly is going on at the center of this particular Last Supper in blue, for instance? That would, from the Da Vinci account, that is more or less where Jesus would be seated. But, you begin to wonder what the narrative is, and what is it that brings all these people together? The sleeping soldier, the figure in the middle. So this is what I meant earlier when I said that he had the confidence to retell stories and narratives. And so it's the opposite of a dogmatic position. It's saying that you can retrieve these core ideas from various traditions and question them or reconfigure them in some way.
Sure, but for a moment, let's look at both the panels joined together. Let's put them together and let's bring the crucified even to the center and line them up, which is how they were displayed at the Jangir when I saw them. And then the whole context again changes. Though I've always wanted to look at each independently in my thought rather than as one single panel. And the figures in the center are the most intriguing in the blue panel for me, which is why I read them wrong as well. But as per his explanation, it's almost a robotic figure. The male figure is kind of a robotic figure, which is actually way ahead of his time when he painted it, and almost sort of impregnating the woman with his sort of chip. And more than that, it's very hard for me to I can conjure many sort of images, but I don't know how accurate I might be with that. Because the fork in her hand is something else, which to me suggests greed. Gluttony, greed. I don't know, I see it that way. And which is why I said I see the certain sort of evil aspects to it. I mean, not that they're evil, but they're faults, human faults.
I keep thinking of what kinds of visualities these paintings conjure up. I was also thinking of how, particularly here, there's some affinity with the animation, world of animation, with the comic strip and all of that. So Again, for me, often it's a curiosity about the worlds from which such paintings emerged. I'm thinking here also of Tayyab Mehta and how there's a way in which movement is represented in his paintings that seems to come out of a certain moment in the history of animation. So this doesn't speak to what these paintings might mean, but it's a curiosity about what kinds of visualities they might come out of.
Yeah, sadly, 2 decades ago, I was too embarrassed to ask too many questions, and I today regret that I didn't. But, the opportunity to see them, now had he been around today, you would have asked so many more questions. But when it's out of sight is out of mind. And I never got around to asking him so many questions that today I could have had a little more clarity on.
Also questions of scale, because we know that in the early part of his career, Husain worked at 2 very different scales. He was a toy maker at one level, and he also painted these vast billboards or hoardings for the movies. So particularly in the red one, I find this play of scale coming into, or even here, there are figures that seem to come from the imaginary world as well as the scale of the toy, and then there are other figures that are more monumental in scope and intended scale, or that really come from the world of monumental sculpture in some cases. So these are just, for me, pathways of reading more than, again, as I said, my primary concern is not, or interest is not in a single stable meaning that the works might have, but in how they move us to think about images.
Yeah, I think a stable image would then, I think viewing the work would end for us. I think this whole thing of revisiting it every time you look at it, for me, I think has a lot more intrigue. And each time I think I've understood them a little better. But my response to them, I remember when I saw it first, still remains the same, which always sort of reassures me of a work of art. Because at times, over time, you feel, well, I'm not as excited about it now.
Which also leads me to think about what might the responsibility of the viewer be. Because the occasion of viewing will bring us snapshots like this, intense, powerful, moving snapshots. But then, where do we place them? Where do we see them in the larger arc of the artist's work? How does that get dealt with for viewers? And we're circling around also the question, for me, this question of the audience and its participation in meaning making, that remains crucial. So if someone didn't know that this was also the painter who created various versions and variants on the Theorama series, this just leaps out of nowhere. So what would the responsibility of the viewer be, and how does one address that?
Shall we throw that to the audience? In terms of viewer, what was your response to these works? Would anyone like to ask a question? Yeah.
I knew about the red version of the Last Supper. It's the first time I'm seeing the blue one, which is kind of related in the whole theorama, and I'm ashamed because I'm supposed to be an art historian. I love this. I feel the drama and the tragedy of Christ. This I'm beginning to understand. That is my response, and I'm a bit embarrassed that I didn't know about this work at all. Can somebody take this?
I don't blame you for it, because whenever these works have been published, people have focused on the red, and the blue remains unpublished, so you just see one version of it. When there are companion paintings and should be displayed together or at least published together.
Did he do just 2 versions, or is there a third version?
There was a painting he did several years later called The Last Supper in the Red, which is a different format. No, Last Supper in the Desert, which is also in reds. but has slightly different characters and different connotations than what these did.
Yeah, because I just met Owais in Qatar, and he said he has one version.
So that is the Last Supper in the the Last Supper in the desert,
Okay.
which is a different format as well in scale, and the references are quite different.
Okay.
No, it's smaller.
This all goes from my personal experience with Husain 35 years ago, if not more, I don't know, so that shows how old I am. And I would consider a different way of writing on Husain now. The thing that fascinated me, because I had several meetings with him while writing the catalogue, that he would have this energy which I couldn't catch up with, So, this is a personal incident and it might lead to other things. He said that he has seen the film, kya naam hai? Hum Aapke Hai Kaun, sorry. And he says, you come and see it with me and you'll know a lot about my paintings and the way I work. So we went off to the theatre, Liberty Theatre on Marine Lines, and filled with people because it was such a popular film. So I guess it was shown for a long time as well. And Husain was given a special seat to sit in the stalls at the back. The owner just welcomed us in style. And so the film went on, and I was getting a little restless. I said, what is happening? But then he said to me, look now. And this was the scenes, the series of shots where this actress, Madhuri Dixit, she's barebacked more or less, but she's got, the shape of her back and torso and whatnot, it stood out because the way the director had pointed this kind of sexuality, I would say. So he said, look, and then what happens is she just gets up with a jerk like that, while she's sitting on a bench. And she walks away from the audience, like. And he said, look, did you see? So I said, what? Then, in fact, I said, no, you enjoy it, it's fine, You enjoy this rhythm. This is what I thought later. You enjoy the rhythm, the duration of that shot. And this has a great relevance, these ideas of rhythm, duration, proportion. It led me to thinking about, even in this film, which wasn't a great film, but he stuck on that image, that image stuck in his head so much that he saw the film 200 times, he says.
No, 200 may be exaggeration.
Yeah.
But no, what he saw that moment in that was what he always believed was the anatomy of the kind of perfect Indian woman, the Tribhang, which is so different, as he explained, from the European female figure. Yeah. And that is that moment that sort of he wanted to catch. So he viewed things he may have been skipping through a lot, but it was those moments that he wanted to see again and again. Yes. Ranjit might be able to.
No, as you were speaking, Roshan, I was thinking back to the film he made very early on, Through the Eyes of a Painter. And I've seen that not 200 times, but I've seen it a great many times.
Yes.
But what leaps out there is not just the images, the obsessive images, but it's also the tempo. There was a great a great sense of duration and the rhythm of images.
Yes.
And when I look at these works or works like this, it's the same kind of sense that you get. How does he conjure up movement or pattern or rhythm or cadence? It's just how you read these things, and I think that's really a challenge for a painter, no? I mean, how do you convey movement and time? That's perennially been a question for painters in particular.
Yes.
Anyone else? You all don't have to feel inhibited. Ranjit can answer all your questions, not me. Yeah.
Figure here, do you have an idea of, is it Jesus, is it another character? The central figure here, I was just wanting their ideas of who it could be. Yeah.
Who do you think it is?
I mean, it looks like Jesus or maybe Mother Teresa's saris. I don't know.
Well, it's a male figure from the hand.
Yes, okay.
But it could be anyone. And the suggestion of a book and a candle give it a certain sort of... But it could be anyone. I wouldn't say necessarily Christ. It's just the robes that give you probably that impression. But it could be any prophet. It could be any learned person. So I think let's stop looking at it from the Da Vinci Last Supper, and then you have far more possibilities. Ranjit?
I'm actually intrigued by what look like props. It's classically the bell, book, and candle kind of idea. What is it? A life of meditation and devotion. Which is why I'm not in favor of a one-to-one correspondence. What does this mean? And usually that's a fatal and pointless question. But I think it's exciting to also look at how the robe is rendered. There's a particular kind of... I was talking earlier about what visualities lie behind these surfaces. It could be the animation strip, could be the mosaic. What are we looking at here? And I think those are sources of excitement for me.
These were done in 1991. Both of them, they were, I think, done one after the other. And if I remember right, he did the work in red first and then the blue. And I think after doing the work in red, he wanted a counterpoint to that, and which is why he said, I've always seen them as one work.
No, these later versions, the Last Supper and the Red Desert and so on, it's interesting what gets played up for Husain in his new location in the Arab world is race very strongly, because there are figures that are clearly African, and he's also thinking through the presence of the African in the history of Islam. There's also a very powerful painting from that period which is called Bilal, who of course was the Prophet's herald and who was a former slave of African origin. So this sense of the underdog, the subaltern, the disregarded being given a place of importance and value, I think that became very, very strong for him, for Husain in those later years. And we need to think about that as well, because he was very aware of discontent and disquietude and was never afraid of putting his finger right on that. Yeah.
May I? Hello? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I also find his work very dynamic in terms of the movement, and I find him also a very performative painter. There's a dramatic narrative going on in his work, and once a long time ago at the Kiran Nader Museum in Delhi, I don't remember the title of the work, but where he himself also was the subject of the artwork.
Since I'm going to claim to be from Lucknow, I'm going to say Pehle aap Delhi.
No, he did put himself in several of his works. In fact, as someone earlier, is that him? And I said, no, it's certainly not him. It's just because that figure has a beard, but that's not his nose structure, that's not his chin, that's not his mouth. But a lot of people do, the minute they see a bearded figure in a Husain painting, they think it's him. But I don't believe that's him at all. But yes, he had this habit of bringing himself, introducing him into the subject matter of what was happening, the narrative in the painting. So you're not wrong at all. Yeah, performance played a big role in his work.
No, but the notion of performance, of theatre, of public, sacred theatre in the public arena, I think from earliest childhood memories, which he writes about in various languages, he talks about the Ram Leela, he also talks about the Taziyas, the Muharram processions. I think that sense of the performance of in some sense, perennial dramas, sacred dramas in a public context, that was very central to his work. And in a way also undergirds his understanding of the cinema. So it works across all of his work.
May I? Sure. Akbar painted not the Last Supper, but Jesus and Judas about 4 times in his life. The first one was just after the court case, where he felt betrayed by other artists. I just thought it might be a useful counterpart.
Just a remark that Husain is very much present there by the symbolism of, let's say, the chhatri, the umbrella. That umbrella occurs all throughout.
Yeah, but then that association with the briefcase doesn't work for Husain, you know what I mean? But the umbrella for sure.
Yeah. But that he deliberately, do you think, wasn't he deliberately using these clashes? Like,
You know, I was wondering what the briefcase was doing there, and I wasn't sure whether it had anything to do with Buster Keaton. But someone can correct me if I'm wrong, because I have tried to find that connect.
That is part of the Buster Keaton iconography, right? I think it is, yeah. But the umbrella for sure is like a signature. Also in Through the Eyes of a Painter. It just lifts up and floats away, if I remember correctly, right, in the film. And Portrait of an Umbrella, yeah. And across, it was like a self-object. But also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, just, I mean, we kind of
look at
the productive digressions. It's interesting how biblical material was so important to so many of these artists. Krishan, for instance. Krishan Khanna's extended meditations on the New Testament, on the Gospels. It's resulted in very, very powerful work. And also the way in which the line between the apostles and the people at the dhaba gets blurred. So that's a completely different understanding of how to bring the sacred down to earth, literally. So it's amazing to think about how the same material was important enough for multiple members of this generation of artists to work with.
Also, I think where Christ was born was a completely different territory from how the Renaissance painters have actually portrayed it. And they've almost made Christ a European when he actually wasn't. He emerges from the Middle East. So I think the possibilities that artists can give to the location are innumerable. We don't have to see through the lens that we've been conditioned to look at it. Ranjit thinks someone was hesitating to ask a question.
it was just a comment for the suitcase, which was about the time when I came to India. Maybe it's Narasimha Rao's suitcase.
Oh, God.
Yeah, here Ranjit's got a very interesting one to tell us. And then the stained glass thing also comes through.
I was just thinking back to one of Charles Correa's abiding projects, the Portuguese church. And like many things Charles did, it was collaborative. So he invited artists. To Husain worked on the stained glass there, and Anjalila Menon had portraits of Jesus. which were rendered in a non-European way, but the opposition to that came from the parishioners, by the way, at that particular moment. This is the 1970s. Things have changed. But again, with thinking here about the contestation between an audience's expectations and what the artist is, what boundaries the artist is pushing. I just thought I'd bring that back to.
No, I think the artist is just way, way ahead. So I think for that moment you will get opposition, and there's always opposition to change. It takes time for the audience to sort of understand and accept it. And Charles Correa mentioning just the Portuguese church would be wrong, because in almost every project of his, when you think of the Secretariat at Bhopal, and it's amazing, I mean, for an architect to incorporate an artist in most of his projects and give him a prominent space. It's not that he's dominating, the artist is sort of collaborating with him, which I think is amazing. Okay, as Ranjit says on that joyous note, shall we... Ranjit's hoping for one more question. He's got more to say and you all have no questions for him. One more, one last one. Who's putting up the hand? Sorry, Ranjit.
We are now free to praise.
Perfect. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Ranjit, so very much.